So welcome everybody to the last Oxford Energy seminar, Oxford Energy Network seminar of this term. We're delighted to have Chris Jardine with us today, but before I introduce Chris, I'll just do the usual sorts of announcements. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Tina Forsett. I'm the Oxford Energy Network convener. And there's some information here about the Oxford Energy Network. If you're not involved, don't get our newsletter each week, please sign up. So we do a sort of reminder of what all the seminars and events are coming up, but we also curate a set of energy news, so about Oxford, but other important sort of scientific energy news as well. So that's a useful thing. You can follow us on Blue Sky if you're into social media. And the new thing that we're doing at the moment is we've got a questionnaire about these seminar series. So we want to hear from people why you're coming, and particularly for people who don't come very often. We'd really like to know what would make it possible for you to come more often, if anything. Do you ever access our online resources? What do you think we could improve? What topics would you like to see us covering? Any other ideas? So please do the questionnaire, even if you don't come often. Particularly if you don't come often, we're delighted to hear from you. The final thing I think I wanted to say was to say that we are starting up again next term. The first talk will be on Tuesday, the 29th of April. That's going to be Professor Taj Arestrian from University College London, and he's going to talk about grounding domestic energy models with data, which is actually a joint project between ourselves and UCL. So it's a nice start. At the end of Chris's talk today, we're going to have some drinks and snacks, so please stay if you can. We know some people might need to leave around 6, but this session will go on till 6:15, and then we can stay for more drinks and so on afterwards. I think that's all the housekeeping things. So just to very briefly introduce Chris. Chris said he started working here in 2000, doing solar energy research, looking at some of the early work, I think, was comparing solar PV on homes in Oxford and Mallorca.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so sort of, yeah. Good job if you can get it right. But so as well, so he carried on doing academic research for a while, and then he sort of also ventured into the commercial world of solar PV, and has been a director of Joju Solar, a major solar installation business, for 18 years. He's also directed or led until very recently, has led all the energy teaching on the environmental change and management master's course. And other teaching throughout the university as well. So he's had this really interesting hybrid career between the sort of commercial side and the academic side, as well as teaching. And we're really delighted to hear from Chris this evening.
Thank you very much, Tina.
If you're able to start talking, Chris,
Slides will appear. Okay, yeah, so really what I'm going to be talking about today is really just kind of a sort of light-hearted romp through the last 25 years of solar PV, telling the story, I suppose, of how it went from very expensive and very niche kind of technology through to kind of where we are today, where we're installing gigawatts of solar every day worldwide. So this is, as Tina says, where it all began. So I joined the ECI in 2000. Working on a project called the PV Compare project, and we were testing 11 different types of solar panels on one roof. This is up at Begbrook Science Park, and there was 6 kilowatts of solar on this roof, which at the time was about 2%. And the interesting thing about this photo is actually less the panels. I'm actually more interested in looking at the background there, because if you look west from Begbrook Science Park, there's now a proposal to install an 860 megawatt solar farm that stretches basically from Woodstock down to Aynsham. And you know, that would have been the view. That's where Begbrook is. So if you look west, where you can see those fields, ultimately that's all going. It's very likely that that's all going to become solar panels. Okay, as far as the eye can see. So to 26-year-old me, that would have been, you know, pretty mind-blowing. Other things that would have been mind-blowing, that the Chinese built a 15 gigawatt solar farm, again stretching all the way out to the horizon. They covered a mountain. Okay, absolutely astonishing bit of engineering, as is the fact that they built a 3 gigawatt solar farm in the sea. Right. The idea that any of this would have happened 25 years ago is absolutely incredible. And I thought, well, you know, that sounds like the basis of a good talk. let's have a look at that. So I think you could kind of get the vibe of where we're going today. It's kind of stuff used to be like this, now it's like this. Holy shit. And I've got 45 slides. So the way that I'm going to break the talk up is I'm going to look at the sort of technological side, look at the improvements in solar technology, and then I'll look at some aspects to do with cost, and lastly I'll look at various aspects to do with really the installation market and where I see the solar markets going in future and some of the issues that they're facing. So the main story in terms of technology really relates to efficiencies. This is quite a standard graph that's sort of produced by NREL every so often, that basically maps the progression of solar cell efficiency over time. And there's a whole host of competing different technologies that broadly get invented and that they start improving over time. If you kind of look at the stuff that's in the marketplace, we're really looking at the blue lines here. So you can see that they're moving from, you know, around about, you know, 12, 15% up towards sort of 24, 25% efficient these days. So that's kind of the technological progress, and there's obviously huge amounts of very high-powered physics and material science going in behind this. I'm going to come back to efficiency in a little bit, but I did want to talk first, really just for narrative flow, about some of the other aspects of solar PV that have also improved over the same period of time. And the first one to look at is really about solar panel lifetimes. Solar panels are warranted for 25 years, but that's obviously kind of the point at which manufacturers are prepared to pay out against. And they'd actually expect solar panels to last much, much longer than that. And so I don't think it's unreasonable to expect solar panels to last 30, 40, maybe even 50 years. And certainly there's some people like SunPower on the market that are already offering 40-year warranties for solar panels. These are some of the panels from the 80s. And really, the cells are still working fine. The only thing that's happened is that the sort of plastic backing is going a bit yellow and crumbly and tired, and that can start to let in water. But one of the big improvements in solar panels is actually the encapsulation technology in the way that they keep water out of the solar panels and prevent them from degrading. And I think it asks a sort of interesting question about, you know, does sort of considering solar PV to have a 25-year lifetime actually undersell it by a considerable amount if we might reasonably expect it to last a bit longer than that. And, you know, we're beginning to see, you know, kind of real world stuff from real world systems. I know there's some people that have joined online that have had solar panels on their roof since the 1990s, still working fine. And we'll be seeing, you know, the early installations from Germany and Japan, you know, reaching their sort of 25-year lifetimes around now. We'll be able to see how they keep going. This is perhaps my favourite example of solar panel lifetime. 2009, an artist called Matt Seidentopf installed a solar-powered sound system in the middle of the Namibian desert, playing Africa by Toto on a loop for eternity. And I just love the idea that someone might stumble across this in 10 years' time, still going, still operating, still playing. It is soft rock. Okay, let's get serious. One of the other things that's improved is really the output of solar panels compared to their capacity. So this is some of the test results from the PV Compare project. And on average, those panels were kind of producing maybe around about 800 kilowatt hours for every kilowatt peak of panels installed. This is actually DC, so as a system, it might have been around 750, 780 kilowatt hours for every kilowatt peak of solar panels. Certainly, the standard assessment procedure methodology at the time would have quoted a value of 750. But now, if you follow the updated methodology, that is now up at 913. So it's been a considerable improvement in the amount of energy that you get out of a solar panel in the real world. So this is kind of irrespective of its efficiency. This is kind of how well it actually works when you put it out into the real world. And we can kind of have a look at some of these improvements by essentially following the efficiency chain and looking at the various different ways in which the losses can occur from a solar PV system, and we can look at the improvements that have been made there. So there's things like the surface coatings to take away dust and dirt are better. Anti-reflective coatings are better. Cells are more uniform, so get better output from the modules. Inverters are more efficient. When we were testing, inverters were maybe 93% efficient. Now they'd be 98% efficient. So that's an immediate 5% win. Better knowledge around cable sizing. So my old colleagues at Joju did some work that showed if you use 6mm cable, the extra, instead of 4mm cable, the extra energy you get out of that system more than pays for the extra thickness of the wire over its lifetime. People are just better at doing those things. I'll just show you a bit more about some of those. This picture at the top, one of the technologies we tested was called multi-crystalline silicon. And if you looked at the modules, it had this sort of very shimmery blue kind of appearance where the different sort of crystal grains were formed into the wafer. And this kind of blue shimmery product was very, very intentionally positioned as a high-tech product for high-tech architecture. And this is perhaps the classic example, the Big Brother 2 house. This is where all the evictions took place in front of this facade of shimmering blue photovoltaic material. But anti-reflective coatings have now got so good that multi-crystalline silicon these days just looks like a dull, uniform, bluey black kind of color, and you don't get that shimmery high-tech appearance. Here's a little video showing how the surface coatings on the glass can actually help bead up the water and take the dirt away. So if you blast mud at it, you can see that it actually just disappears and runs away. It keeps the solar panels clean. That's obviously going to improve. And similarly, what's called cell mismatch or module mismatch is really about uniformity of products. So the output of a solar panel, because all the cells are connected in series and all the modules are connected in series, you're only as good as the worst link in that chain. And this applies to shading. So if you shade part of a solar panel, then actually the whole solar panel performs as badly as the shaded bit. But it also applies to the cells themselves. So if you go to a solar module factory, for example, they will take each individual cell and they'll measure it. They'll make sure it's not got any cracks in it. They'll see what its output is, and then they'll put them into different bins for different types of modules, so that all the modules are made out of a uniform set of cells. And that basically improves the uniformity of the product, and that increases the overall output by, not having one duff cell limiting the performance of the whole thing. So that's another improvement that's happened above and beyond efficiencies. This was kind of the debate that we were looking at when we were running the PV Compare project, was to look at, does solar power work in the UK? And if solar power does work in the UK, which kind of technologies perform the best? So I'll just talk people through the 3 generations of solar PV technologies, which are kind of broad classes of different types of technology. So what's called the first generation of solar is made out of crystalline silicon. So this is where you kind of grow a crystal of silicon, much like a copper sulfate crystal when you were a kid, and then slice it up. And these give you, pretty high efficiency, but they're quite high cost, because you have to grow those crystals, and it's done as a batch process, and it's not very well suited to mass production. Along came a second generation of solar PV, which were called thin film materials, and they include such novel things as amorphous silicon, cadmium telluride, copper indium diselenide, and these are solar materials that you can essentially spray on to a backing substrate, maybe glass or plastic, very, very thin, maybe a thousandth of a millimeter thick, super low material inputs. And these can be done on a reel-to-reel process, so they're well suited to mass production. So the idea behind the second generation was that there'd be lower efficiency, but because they could be mass produced, or they looked well suited to being mass produced, that they could be produced at lower cost. And then the third generation of solar PV cells is a whole host of different technologies that haven't quite made it to market yet. And they would include things like quantum dots or dye-sensitized cells. People in Oxford will be particularly interested in organic solar cells and perovskite solar cells, because there's people around the university and various spin-outs that are very active in both of those technologies, but they'd still be considered third generation solar because they haven't reached the market yet. But the ambition would be that there'd be super high efficiency and super low cost. And that's obviously the holy grail from a technology point of view. Just while I'm talking on third generation solar cells, just want to do a little quick aside on something called Gretzel cells or dye-sensitized cells. This is one of the novel third generation technologies, and it uses a sort of titanium dioxide substrate in conjunction with iodine and some sort of a dye. Now, this is not important at all to the story of the rise of solar PV, but given that the world is going to hell in a handcart, it might be useful to know that you can make a solar panel out of sunscreen and Ribena. We can give it a try. There's instructions right here. You can give it a go, and I've done it. It works. Anyway, back to the serious stuff again. This is kind of the results of what happened in the PV Compare project, and we were looking at the different outputs produced by these different panels, and what it seemed to show is that this second generation of technologies, copper indium diselenide at the top and the amorphous silicon, was actually better than the first generation of the crystalline products that are shown in the blue and the black there. And the reason for that was they actually quite like the blue light that we get under the UK's cloudy skies. And in the UK, we get the majority of our light at low light levels under cloudy skies. So they perform very, very well in the UK. And copper indium diselenide in particular also likes the cold. And the climate here is obviously fairly cold, so that gave it an extra boost. So we thought, well, these are going to be the technologies that therefore win out in the marketplace because they seem to have a competitive advantage over the sort of first generation of technologies. But kind of got it wrong because ultimately that wasn't what happened. We thought it was an important thing that some panels gave you a bit more energy than others. We actually wrote this report. Instead of putting it as a dusty old journal, we used to sell these in the Centre of Alternative Technology bookshop because we thought that people that were interested in getting solar should know this stuff. These are the kind of results that we saw, but ultimately this isn't what plays through into the market, and for a couple of reasons. The first is that the microgeneration certification scheme basically said if you're quoting for a solar PV system, you have to use these values. Okay, and that kind of wiped out all nuance between different types of panel, but it was a very, very good thing because it stopped installers just making up their own numbers, right? And that would have been a disaster in the early market if you didn't have those kind of rules and regulations in place. So although that kind of nuance was destroyed, I still maintain that that is a good thing. But the other piece is that actually efficiency is important. And basically, if you're going to put scaffolding up, which is costly, and you're going to get some guys there to do the roofing and the electrics, then actually you probably want to generate as much electricity as you can and split those fixed costs over as much generation as you possibly can. So we were kind of paying attention to these kinds of numbers when actually the answer was staring us in the face in this column. That was the important one, that these first generation kind of products were actually more efficient and producing more electricity, and that's what people wanted. We can kind of look at this in a slightly different way, in that we've got our first generation technologies, high cost, high efficiency, second generation, lower efficiency, low cost, and the holy grail of the third generation, high efficiency, low cost. And the belief back then, back in the early 2000s, was that we would go from the first generation to the second generation and then superseded with the third generation. What actually happened was that the second generation technologies got more efficient and they got a little bit cheaper. But the first generation crystalline silicon technologies got mass produced. And that mass production just dramatically reduced their cost. And they've kind of cut off the route for these guys to become the dominant players. So the second generation technologies didn't take off at all. The market today is 98% of this and maybe 2% of this. The implications are also for people trying to develop these new technologies, the third generation technologies, is that their barrier to entry is now really, really high. They have to be super efficient and super low cost in order for them to get any sort of a look into that. I'm going to show you the same kind of picture, but in a slightly different way, by introducing you to another technology that kind of appeared in the mid-2010s, which is a new class of essentially higher efficiency panels. Now, they're kind of based on the crystalline silicon technologies, but the clever thing that they did is that they kind of moved all the positive and the negative electrodes to the back of the cell, which meant that you don't have wires on the front anymore shading the front. And there's also some kind of quantum physics stuff that makes them more efficient. And you can kind of map that kind of progression in the market. But in 2010, you just kind of had your standard sort of panels that would be selling at around about 60 pence per watt. And then by 2014, their costs had dropped down to about 40, but the high efficiency panels came onto the market, and they were probably up around about 18% efficient compared to 16% efficient, but they came at a price premium. So you had this kind of split market where you could either have standard modules for a cheaper price, or you could have higher efficiency modules for a higher price, and that was very much up to the consumer which way they wanted to go. And certainly in the domestic setting, these super high efficiency panels were quite an attractive option. In the commercial setting, most people went for these kind of standard panels just for cost reasons. We start to map that through to 2018. We see these kind of cost reductions coming in both sets of technologies. But by around about 2022, standard efficiency, sort of standard panels had really become very efficient indeed. And if you sort of look at the trade-off here, you start to question whether it's worth paying that price premium for the higher efficiency panels. And when we were sort of quoting for systems, it started to look a little bit ridiculous to say, you can generate 2% more, but you have to pay, £1,000 more. It started to look not very sensible at all. And by the time we reached 2024, that was even more pronounced, to the extent that, these standard panels were so good, why would you bother installing anything else? And also in 2024, a Chinese company called ICO actually introduced the most efficient panel on the market, but instead of selling it for 60p, they were selling it for 13p. Okay, so we're now in a situation of why would you buy these sun power panels? Won't really buy anything else other than this green one, which is ICO. So that's done some sort of slightly funny things to the market in that there isn't really such a thing as a premium panel anymore. There's just a bunch of really good, high efficiency, low cost panels on the market. And this has kind of implications for the third generation panels trying to enter into that market. I'll just touch on this because there might be people in the room or online. So Oxford's very good at plastic PV. Plastic PV is going to be coming in here at this end, at sort of low efficiency, low cost. They're not really going to be able to compete with what's available and most people are installing. So the challenge for organic solar PV is to try and find a niche somewhere that sort of suits its characteristics, and that might be something like putting it on greenhouse glazing for agricultural products or something like that. It's likely to be very lightweight as well, so there might be applications on very large warehouse that can't take the weight of conventional module. So that's where organic solar PV might sit. And then the other interesting third generation technology is perovskites. And there's groups in Oxford looking very intensively at perovskites. Perovskites will be taking a panel like this and adding another layer of perovskite material on top to boost the efficiency, maybe up to about 28%, something like that. So the question is, if you went back to this kind of situation and you had a 28% efficient panel, then you could probably charge 80 pence, maybe £1 a watt for it. Whereas nowadays, I think, well, this is the market, I think you'll probably struggle to charge more than 20 pence. Okay? So that makes life difficult for anyone trying to introduce the perovskites, is that you've obviously got additional manufacturing cost and not a lot more profit to pay back 15, 20 years worth of research and development effort. Whereas if they could have launched 5, 10 years ago, they would have had an absolute boom time. So interesting implications. We'll wait and see what happens in the market. I'll just talk loosely about a couple of other changes that have happened these are perhaps a little bit more superficial. But when we started looking at the PV Compare project, the modules are really, really small. Okay, maybe as small as 14 watts, so they'll be about this big. Standard one would be maybe 85 watts, which would be, so big. Whereas now it's not uncommon for a 400-watt module to be installed. This is a good friend of ours installing 500-watt module. Okay, and that's above 2 meters by a meter. And obviously, the advantage of going to these bigger modules is that you need less mounting system, and you need less panels to install, so the labour's also quicker and cheaper. But it's certainly a long way away from the days when you could carry a module up a ladder onto your arm. One of the other trends that we're seeing is a trend towards all black modules. They're certainly rising in popularity. Historically, panels used to have this kind of white backing sheet and a silver frame. And the trend now is towards black frames, black backing sheets. And I think that might be a sign of sort of market maturity, maybe, in that your innovators who are really interested in technology might want something that looks obviously like technology. Early adopters, who are kind of the people that like to be seen to do stuff first, might also like something that very obviously looks like a solar panel. But as you move into the early mass market, actually, people might want something that's a little bit more modest and discreet. The other trend I think we're seeing is a trend towards recessing modules rather than mounting them on top of a roof. You actually take the tiles away, put a waterproof backing behind that, and then drop the panels into the hole so that they sit flush. And I think they look very, very nice and neat, particularly when you combine them with slate. And these recessed black modules on slate, I think, are sort of grade A aesthetics for solar panels. So that, I think, covers the technology changes that we've seen over the last 25 years. But we can't tell the story of the rise of solar PV without looking at economics. And most of you will be familiar with this kind of cost reduction curve, where back in 1975, solar panels cost around about $100 a watt. And that had dropped down to $1 a watt by 2012. And now in 2025, we're seeing, in the UK, we're seeing prices of less than 10p per watt for solar panels. It's really quite an astonishing cost reduction that has happened, and obviously that drop in cost is what's driven the market. I thought rather than do a sort of academic approach to this, I'll give you a couple of little vignettes of solar panel cost. First is solar panels are cheaper than fence panels these days. So you can buy a 1 metre by 1.8 metre solar panel for about £40. And that's certainly cheaper than certainly a high-end fence panel, and it will last longer. So should we be making fences out of solar panels, even if you never plug them in? Plugging them in is a nightmare from a shading perspective. It's a ridiculous idea, but kind of a nice sort of illustrator of where we've got to in terms of the cost of. They're also pretty much as cheap as roof tiles. I did some kind of back of an envelope calculations here. Solar panels probably around about £25 per metre squared. But pallets of roof tiles, these came out at about £30. These came out around about £18. But they're certainly comparable to roof tiles in terms of price. And the reason that I came up with this is, there's been a lot of talk that we should legislate solar panels on new buildings. And ultimately, the decision was not to enforce that. And the reason behind that is, what if the solar panels are under a tree? We can't legislate someone to put solar panels under a tree, therefore we're not going to legislate it. And I would say, There's no cost penalty. You might even be making it cheaper for the building developer to use solar panels instead of roof tiles. Again, even if you never plug it. My third little vignette is what's called a marginal abatement cost curve. And these were kind of de rigueur, I guess, around the 2000s, I suppose. And they basically looked at the sort of lifetime cost of different ways of reducing carbon and how much carbon they could save. And the broad picture was, energy efficiency stuff was down here, and solar PV was always basically right at the right-hand side. And I've been trying to find kind of an updated one of these that's more modern and has solar in the right place. And I can't find one. I don't think anyone's done one. But certainly nowadays, solar is going to be in this negative section here, alongside more classic energy efficiency measures. And in 2019, this led to one of perhaps the high point of my career when I gave a talk to the UK Passive House Conference. And the basic theme of my talk was, solar's so cheap, is fabric first the right approach anymore? Didn't go down very well. But if you were approaching this from a purely sort of techno-economic standpoint, then I think that is a valid question to ask. I should just caveat, I do think that fabric first is the right thing to do. This is kind of a classic bit of technology learning. So this is kind of a logarithmic plot of the price of solar panels against how much has been cumulatively deployed. And they broadly follow this kind of straight line trajectory, and that's basically what's called technology learning. So the more you do of something, the better you get at it, and the cheaper it becomes. And basically every tenfold increase in solar panel deployment gives you basically a 30% reduction in price. Two interesting points here. One is that solar PV is very, very modular. Okay, these numbers can get very, very, very big indeed. Whereas, there's a lot of talk about small modular nuclear reactors. They're not very modular. We might do 100, 1,000 maybe, but it's not going to compete with going out here. So one of the key advantages, and the reason that solar is becoming the cheapest technology around, is that you can get lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of learning. How does that learning happen? This is a report from McKinsey that basically looked at where all those different gains were coming from, and basically they're all the way through the supply chain, from mining to melting the silicon to making the cells, making the modules, installing them. Everything just gets a little bit better, marginal gains all the way through. And I think you could do the same again for 2020 to 2030, and you'd see basically the same picture, just repeat it. So there's no real reason to expect that those cost reductions are going to stop in any way. It's also worth noting it's not just the solar panels. So inverters have also gone dramatic cost reductions. Even things like the rails, which used to be dedicated solar rail, which is quite expensive, is now just a bit of extruded aluminium, which is what it is. Okay, so the costs have come down there as well. And also, it's not just the technology, it's the institutions as well. So installation companies are better at what they're doing than they were 10 years ago. This picture at the top is me on the roof of Aldi in Botley Road. It was our first ever 50 kilowatt installation, and it took 2 weeks for us to build. This bottom one is also 50 kilowatt installation, and those panels went down in 3 days. Last little bit on costs. One of the sort of interesting pieces is, certainly at the moment, very topical, relates to tariffs. And back in 2013, there was a fairly major trade dispute between China and the EU, where the EU believed that the Chinese government was essentially subsidising the price of manufacture of solar panels to drive Western manufacturers out of business. And so in June, the EU applied nearly a 50% tariff on Chinese solar panels. And Chinese responded with a tariff on EU wine. Okay, so you can start to see, this is major industries, being played off against each other here. And eventually a compromise was reached with a minimum price on Chinese imports. And interestingly, that was on Chinese manufactured imports, not Chinese owned imports. So it kind of reinforced the trend that the Chinese would open factories in the Philippines, in South Africa, in Poland, and do them that way. It also came up with one of the most genius things that I've ever heard. So in June 2013, this tariff was applied. By the end of June 2013, every single warehouse in Croatia was stacked to the brim with solar panels made in China. And then on the 1st of July 2013, Croatia joined the EU. And all the panels came with it. This is kind of the current situation. Obviously, the Americans have had tariffs on Chinese panels for some time. And this is a graph of Chinese solar panel exports and where they're going. The scale is in gigawatts per month. And you can see that the North American tariffs are having the desired effect. Chinese panels aren't going to the US. The good news story is that they seem to be going to the global south. So we're seeing big increases in Asia, especially Pakistan, increases in Latin America, and we're even beginning, somewhat belatedly, to see a bit of a rise in Africa as well, which I think. So my last section is really on installer markets. Just give you a bit of market history. This was really stimulated in the late 1990s, early 2000s, with the 100,000 roofs program in Germany, 70,000 roofs program in Japan. And that kind of had an effect on the sort of manufacturing base, where back in the day, this used to be fossil fuel companies playing around with alternative technology just in case it was the next big thing. So it's people like BP Solar and Shell Solar, for example. But once these programs were in place, you started seeing, the Japanese industrial conglomerates like Sharp, Kyocera, Sanyo, for example, German companies as well, beginning to dominate the market until the 2010s, when you started seeing essentially the rise of even cheaper Chinese manufactured solar panels. And the first hint of that was this, which is the 2010 World Cup in South Africa with the Vuvuzelas, not just Vuvuzelas, but Yingli Solar, a completely unheard of company, was one of the major sponsors of the World Cup. And that was kind of one of the first indicators that, wow, solar PV really is big business. Sponsoring the World Cup. We're a little bit slower to take off in the UK, and it wasn't really until the 2010s when we got feed-in tariffs that the market took off. I will just show you what happened a little bit before, mainly because we did a report on it. This was something called the Low Carbon Buildings Programme to incentivise all forms of microgeneration, including PV. And the output of that scheme was 919 installations over the 2 years of that programme. I think it was a very successful programme. Certainly the demand for the grants that was available was very, very high. The grants started running out, so the government decided to introduce monthly awards of grants. But then those monthly awards of grants started disappearing by 10:30 in the morning on the first of the month. Okay, so the consumer demand for those grants was very, very, very high indeed. And the other things that we found was, there's 59 companies in the market, so they did an average of about 8 installations a year in that period of time. So this was 2006 to 2008. But in 2010, we did finally get feed-in tariffs in the UK, perhaps a little bit belatedly, and it's been a rocky journey. This is affectionately known in the industry as the solar coaster because of so many ups and downs. I can just tell you briefly what those were. So they were introduced in 2010 and the market started to pick up and grow as expected. But then the government's got cold feet a little bit and thought, oh, this is getting a little bit pricey. We're going to cut tariffs by 50%. And when they announced this, basically for a couple of month period, the market went absolutely ballistic in late 2011, to the extent that the UK ran out of scaffolding. Okay. Now, this 50% cut actually proved to be unlawful. Friends of the Earth took the government to court. They made the fatal mistake of announcing the outcome of a consultation before it had ended. So it was actually another 3 months before that actually finally came into force, which meant, of course, that there was another rush in March of 2012. And then they announced another 30% cut in August, which led to another mini rush in August of that year. There then followed a period of relative stability where feed-in tariff support was cut down very gradually once certain installation targets have been met. So that kind of steadied the market out for a bit until 2016, when the new Conservative government announced an energy policy reset, and they implemented a 60% cut in tariffs again at that point, and that had the effect of really suppressing the market at a very low level, and only really picked up since the energy crisis. Just talk a little bit. Sorry, abolished in 2019. Okay, I will run through. So the energy crisis, obviously, double your electricity price, you halve the payback of solar PV. So everyone goes nuts for it. These are the inquiry levels from a couple of different solar installation companies. And you can see they were both rocking along at about 100, and then all of a sudden they were getting 800 or so inquiries in a month, right? And none of the installers could particularly keep up with that, and all the installers ended up restricting in some way, either by saying, we're only working within 20 miles of our head office, or we're not doing slate roofs because they're too difficult. Everyone sort of shut down at that point. And obviously prices went up because price was really the only handle that installers had to just try and slow everything down a little bit. The interesting effect that the energy crisis has had is that it has led to a big rush of new market entrants. So we've gone from around about 1,000 installers in the UK to around about 4,000 now. 4,000 is quite a lot. I always like to think of it per county. It's about 70 installation companies per county. And those are levels that we haven't seen since the big rush back in 2012. So there's a lot more players in that market. And although the market is booming, from an individual installer perspective, you saw this big sort of uptick. But once these new market entrants had arrived, actually everyone's doing less jobs. Okay, so for individual installation companies, it's actually not boom time. It's boom time overall, but it's super competitive, and a lot of installers are finding that very hard to deal with. And residential solar, I think, is particularly difficult as a space because of the amount of competition in that. And I just looked up some companies and their net worth on Companies House and how long they've been trading. And you can see that these companies, these are residential only companies, may be making about £10,000 a year. You know, it's not a big money earner. And I think a lot of people sort of consider installing solar panels as a sort of vocational work, and they're prepared to do huge amounts of work for actually very, very little reward. There's a whole range of different players in the solar market, from utilities down to sort of 1 or 2 man bands, and they've all got different kinds of business models. What I think we're seeing is that the middle bit is getting very, very squeezed. The 1 or 2 man bands don't have a sales team, don't have project managers. This is just people selling solar so that they can get a day's worth of labour on the roof. So these guys can always undercut the market. And then at the top end, utilities getting increasingly involved. They've got a nice, easy route to market, so they just email their customers and say, solar panels. Right? So these guys are finding it very, very tough. And in the middle here, I think it's really a bit of a digital media bun fight to try and get noticed, which is proving increasingly difficult in a world of AI, where people researching solar panels get served the answer by AI, and they don't even click through to install a website anymore. One of the other things why I think installers are finding it difficult is, if you look at the breakdown of costs in 2010 compared to 2025, back in the day, the sort of material costs in blue were more than 50% of the cost of your job. Then you'd have sort of scaffold and labour, and the red bit would be your margin, which covers all your sales and project management, and then leaves you with a bit of profit, hopefully, out of that red bit. We're now in a situation where actually labour is more important than the cost of the kit. And actually the biggest single line item is probably the cost of your sales force, that no one's actually costing properly, because they're just taking this and adding 25% on, just like they always used to do. And it just doesn't work anymore. So I think there's a piece where the whole industry is sort of not really got its pricing right. Get a couple of slides. It all leads to a bit of a race to the bottom, and there's a number of different ways in which you can race to the bottom. Cheaper components, a hard sell, outsource your design to India. Some companies don't bother surveying, just rock up with a van and make it up when they come to the install. Slack installation methods, just nail the wire to a wall. Less qualified labour rather than very skilled tradesmen. So all of these sort of price pressures are happening, and not all of them, I would say, are necessarily good for the market or the consumer. To touch on commercial PV, commercial PV is really, really good for customers at the moment. They've got high electricity prices, rates of return on investment are probably well above 20% at the moment, and they're also good for installers, because actually in the commercial space, installers can charge a higher margin than in the residential space because it's less competitive. So they can actually make some money. And if you look at the solar companies making money, they've all got some kind of commercial aspect to their offering. This is me on the telly, local news, an installation at Flo's Cafe in Florence Park. They were paying 67p for their electricity, and I had to go on the news saying, their payback's a year and a half. Like, unheard of to 26-year-old me. But classic barriers for commercial solar still remain. So businesses would rather spend any money they have on their core business rather than buying solar panels. There's lots and lots of decision makers in a business, and you have to persuade all of them that getting solar panels is a good idea. So they're very hard to sell. And even if they want to do it, they might not own the building. So you have the classic kind of landlord-tenant split. So, Labour's talking quite a lot about we're going to have a rooftop revolution, but I haven't seen anything in policy that addresses any of those barriers to actually make it happen. To talk also a bit about ground mount. Broadly, consumer attitudes for solar are very, very supportive in the ground mount sector. Only sort of 2-3% would actively oppose solar PV, but they can be a very vocal minority in opposition to solar farms is growing. It poses an interesting question of how big is too big. Classic wind farm debates, but we're having it with solar now. I thought I'd give you my view. I think it's possible to hold two completely contradictory positions on this at once. One is to say we need to get to net zero. Climate change is really serious. We need masses and masses of renewables, and we should just get on with it. And then on the flip side, you go, ooh, this is a bit big for the kind of landscape. I've come up with something I like to call Chris's law of cows. It looks like a dairy farm, feels okay. It looks like an Australian ranch, then that's probably an unsuitable scale for this. I think the interesting thing here is that solar is kind of inherently a sort of diffuse distributed bit of technology, but the places where you can develop projects are where you've got grid capacity. So the reason that there's a very big project proposed for Oxford is because Didcot Power Station has shut. So you've got your renewable energy development still dictated by the legacy fossil fuel industry and the associated infrastructure that is driving a certain type of development. And if the grid operators, the DNOs, were a bit more proactive in sort of releasing capacity in different areas, then you could get your dairy farm style model. This, I think, is one of the key answers. I'm a massive fan of agrivoltaics, which is where you actually combine solar panels with farming, be that livestock or crops. And there's increasing reports coming out that show that it's mutually beneficial. So yields of grapes are higher grown under solar panels, and the grapes have more flavonoids in them, so they taste better. Plus you get the solar generation, higher levels of wool production because the sheep don't have heat stress, so on and so forth. This one is matcha tea down in the bottom left-hand corner, again grown under solar panels. And it can be done. Italy ran a 1.5 gigawatt tender specifically for agrivoltaics. I think it's a really, really nice model that I think the UK could think about following in its future rounds. Just close off with 3 last thoughts. Still going. This one is a report that's just come out showing actually solar is likely to be the cheapest source of electricity worldwide by 2030, apart from very few niche places where hydro or wind is super, super cheap. And the worldwide market, I'm expected to continue growing. It's been growing at 30–40% a year for the last 30 years. And why wouldn't that trend keep going? If you say that on social media, a lot of people will say, oh, well, that's only possible because it was subsidised. To which my answer and my kind of final thought that I'll leave you with is, if it grew that fast when it wasn't cost competitive, how fast do you think it's going to grow now it's the cheapest stuff around? So I'll leave you there, just leave you with a bit of shameless self-promotion. Active on LinkedIn, Threads and Blue Sky, so do give me a follow there. If you've enjoyed this talk, my next projects are likely to be sort of a bit more video based. So I've also sort of squatted those Instagram, YouTube and TikTok handles. So if you give me a follow there, you can be the first people to see what comes next. So thank you very much.